Jay Baba,
Jay Baba.
welcome, thank you, welcome to this talk about Saint Augustine, also known as Augustine of Hippo, which is a city in today's Algeria,
Does
Africa.
that still exist as Hippo, or is it changed names?
I'm not sure.
Hippo.
Hippo. So, St. Augustine of Hippo. And we're going to talk about, now St. Augustine wasn't just a saint, he was, I should say this, is that St. Augustine, Baba mentioned as one of his favorite Christian saints, and second most only after St. Francis. So this is a saint that was important to Baba. And it's interesting because St. Augustine was also a great philosopher. He lived in the 4th and 5th centuries, corresponding with the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. And we're going to talk a little about where he lived here. Okay, this is so he lives about 350 to 400 years after Christ.
Yeah.
But this is the Roman Empire at the time of Christ, but because our story spans before Christ and then long after, I've just used this sort of 1A.
Is Hippo on that map there, Chris?
Is what?
Hippo, is that
No,
on the
it's
map?
not. No, I just took this. This is at the time of Christ's birth,
Yeah.
how the Roman Empire looked. But I'm going to be saying places like Africa, Egypt, Italy, Greece, and I want people to see that all of these at that time are very close together. They just sort of sprinkle around the Mediterranean Sea. So where St. Augustine is born, Hippo, is right here in what's Algeria.
That's very
And
good.
so you see how close this is to the center of the Roman Empire, Rome. And then we're also going to go back in time, we're going to talk about Plato, who lived in Greece. So this is before the Roman Empire, but you see it's still around the Mediterranean. And we're going to talk about another philosopher named Plotinus, who lived in Egypt and died in Italy. And so just to have a feeling that we're talking about a very small part of the world where all this, where our story takes place. And I like to see that, because when I hear Africa, I just picture, oh, that's so far away from Europe, but it's really not.
No. And then you've got, between Sicily and Africa, you have Malta.
Well, this is how things were at the time of Christ.
No, but I'm saying there's a little island called Malta that's between Sicily and Africa.
Okay.
Malta. And now that you mentioned it, I agree with you. In the Bible world, very little is known about St. Augustine. Everybody talks about St. Francis, and they go there, and that's fine. But very little is known about St. Augustine. They haven't put on a play about St.
Well,
Augustine.
as a matter of fact, some people
You know what I'm saying?
have a negative idea, because there's some sort of New Age modern literature that's negative about Augustine, but I don't know why.
In the Bible world. You know,
But as I explained Augustine, you're going to like Augustine, I think. I used to be jealous of, I thought there was this other saint who sounded more cool than him, Augustine. I thought, who's Augustine? And then I found out that's Augustine. So it's kind of a cool way to say Augustine, probably more authentic. Anyway, so I got to move along. So he's born here, and he is, although he's in Africa, he is a Roman citizen, and his family speaks Latin. And he, no one knows what he looked like. These are all depictions of St. Augustine. But his ethnicity is called a Berber, and I have a picture, I believe, of a Berber right here. There's a Berber woman today, so doing a traditional dance. And his mother, I've read out, may have been actually black, but no one really knows. So,
is that Berber the same form of the Barbary Coast, I wonder? Berber and Barbary?
no, I don't know. I don't know. Okay. Did I? Okay. So where are we going to start? All right. We're going to talk about St. Augustine as a philosopher. and we're going to talk about his philosophy. And I might have to give this talk again because I've never given it before, and I've never really written this all out, and so it's very extemporaneous. But where we're going to begin, so that we understand what he's born into, is we're going to have to talk about Plato. Now, if you've seen any of my earlier talks, we covered Plato, and we covered Plato's cave, and I showed an animation that explained it. But we're going to have to go over that right now. So Plato lived like 350 BC, so 600 years before Augustine, and Plato was the student of Socrates, who never wrote anything, just asked very deep questions. And after Socrates was put to death for disrupting the peace with his questions and his ideas, Plato took up the pen and started writing. And he would put all his ideas into the mouth of Socrates. So Socrates became a character in the dialogues of Plato, where he would depict Socrates having dialogues with the people of Athens, Greece. Now, Plato, I won't say the influences on Plato because that's just too much for the talk, would be too long. But Plato had a different view of reality than most people, and definitely than Aristotle, who was a student of his. He believed that there wasn't just true and false, okay? Like we think today. Like when you do logic, you come up with either true or false. That's from Aristotle. Plato believed that there were degrees of truth, okay? And degrees of knowledge, that higher knowledge knew a more true reality. So I'll quickly go over this cave again, as I have before in my talks. In this allegory that he gives for his view of the levels of reality, he has a cave. This is supposed to be the entrance to the cave, and then down at the very back of the cave, near the wall of the cave, there are these prisoners. And they're all chained up in such a way that they face the back wall of the cave. And they see shadows that are really tricks being played upon them by people who are walking along these this roadway, carrying little effigies, little statues, moving around. And the slaves, as horrible as it sounds, they've been chained up like this with their faces looking forward, so they can't even turn to the left or right, since birth. So they've never known any world except these shadows. Now, this level of reality is what he calls imagination. So, yeah, I guess images. Okay. This is another tool that Plato used to explain his system. It's called the divided line. But you see, perception is very low. So let's call this perception. All these false perceptions are called doxa, which is far from, I believe, nous or something like that, which is the reality. The reality is out here, it's the sun. Now, a prisoner gets freed in his story and gets led out of the cave. He gets to see what he's been seeing all his life. He's been seeing the shadows of these archetypes. And then he goes out and sees the real sun in the real world, and he sees reality. And these are these levels. Mathematical forms are a higher level of reality than perception. And then the highest forms are like, I believe, beauty and courage and things like that, the highest principles. I think that's right. So we see now, that's what Plato taught. Now, after Plato's death, we have the rise of Christianity came along. And it dispensed with the works of the pagans. which includes the Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, because they were pagan, they weren't Christian, they wanted to focus on the Bible, and so it's like a whole new world order. And so those books were lost, but they were but the ideas of Plato, okay, that are like what I just described, although were preserved in Christianity by St. Augustine, okay? This is both the philosophy and where the mystical stream of Christianity comes from. And okay, and now I'm going to explain that. And I'm going to explain, later I'll explain that this has basically disappeared from Christianity since then, and I'll show why. Okay. Augustine lived in the Roman Empire. His mother was a Christian, Monica. His father was a pagan, and he was a drinker and a gambler, kind of like Al. So always gambling. And she prayed to God that Augustine would convert to Christianity. But Augustine was very good looking and very smart, and he through his charisma and his mother's help, they got him into college and to study rhetoric, being able to make arguments, kind of like law school. And he was one of the most brilliant men of his time, but he was also a big playboy. And he's famous for the line, "God grant me chastity, but not yet." So it's funny that this is Baba's favorite, one of his favorite Christian saints, because he's sort of one of the famous bad boys of Christianity. And that's why his mother Monica suffered so much. She was always trying to get him to convert. Now, Augustine didn't want to convert to Christianity because he said it was new, it was a new religion. And frankly, it didn't make any sense to him. And he looked at the Bible, and it just didn't make any damn sense. So he wanted a religion that was more intellectual, more for guys like him, a philosopher. So he chose a religion called Manichaeanism. Okay, and I have to explain Manichaeanism. The word Manichaean survives today and means a person who thinks in black and white, just good and evil. There was around the year 200, around 200 years after Jesus, there was a man who lived in Iran named Mani, just like Baba's sister's name. And he was an artist, and he was kind of a New Age guy. He gave a teaching. Oh, he said that he was the reincarnation of Jesus and Buddha and Zoroaster. But he doesn't seem to have been. And his philosophy, it was a form of what they call, in retrospect, they call it Gnosticism, but that's a term that didn't even exist then. That's sort of an anachronism to call it that. But today, it's a form of Gnosticism. Gnostics had various features in common. And his world had gods and stuff like that. But the main thing is that there were two substances in the world. There was good and there was evil. And evil was really like a stuff. And matter was made out of this evil substance. It was an evil substance. So this is evil, and it's made out of the evil stuff. And that spirit was another thing, and it was made out of good. This is where. And so these guys were very ascetic. They never married, one of the reasons. But they still survived for 800 years. Now, one of the things that's funny about them is that they had a thing called the seat of Mani. And the adept, and Augustine never became a full adept. He almost did. He got invited to get initiated to be one, but he never did. He was sort of always a novice. But the adepts would stand around a chair like this and do their prayers. And that's funny. I find that funny because kids sometimes are embarrassed that Baba lovers bow to a chair. The Baba's chair. But they're not the first to do so, just so you know. The Manichaeans did that at this time. Now, the Manichaeans survived for another 600 years. They only disappeared, which was a long time, around
How big do you think they were?
Very large, and they were all over the world.
Oh,
They're very, very huge. Now, even in the East, I think in China and stuff, they were really, it was a huge cult, okay? But, so he felt he was really with the smart guys, the cool guys, the cool crowd. And he had, but he had certain philosophical questions that bothered him. Not to do from Christianity, just philosophical questions. And one of the main ones was, what is the nature of evil? What is evil? Because it's not in Greek philosophy to talk about it, okay? I mean, and before that, there's no. So, oh, I should say, I hope I did say this.
do you know where the word comes from?
With evil?
Yes.
No, I don't. I don't know the source of the word evil. So, but it probably wouldn't, well, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. However, I should also say, he never saw any writing by any ancient philosophers, okay? Because all that had been gotten rid of. There were places in the world where it was being preserved, and we'll get to that, but he never saw the writings of Plato or anything like that. He's pretty much got the Bible, and he's on his own, okay? And so he finds out, but he has this problem with what is evil, and he finds out that he's going to have the opportunity to meet the big grand wizard of the Manichaeans. And he's quite excited about this, because they'll have to real man to man. And he'll be able to ask him his questions. And there were other. And so this finally came up, and he was very excited. It was like going to meet Baba, or something like my dad talking about going to meet Baba. I was like, oh my God, I'm going to meet the big cheese. And he got in his presence, and there he was, and Augustine asked him his questions, and the guy had no answers. And Augustine was horrified. He said, this is the biggest you've got, and this is supposed to be a Gnostic, which means, like gnosis. You guys have the knowledge, the hidden secret knowledge. And this guy who's the head of you guys, he can't even answer my questions, and I'm not even an adept yet, and he can't answer my questions. And he didn't know it, and this is still a thing Christians talk about, that you basically have to have good, as Augustine would later say, and Baba also said, is merely the absence of good. And you have to have good for there to be evil, like you have to have light for there to be a shadow. And God is the good. See, Augustine later realized that God, just where the focus is not on God, we call that evil. Okay, so it sort of goes into a darkness. It's an absence. But this guy couldn't say it all. So see, they had this evil stuff, but he didn't know what it was. So he realized that this is fairly childish, and they're not great, the Manichaeans. And then he kind of was in a crisis, and he didn't know what to do. So he happened at the time to run into another saint. And isn't it just like Baba, like we learned from Baba, that like with the story of Ukasni, when he meets a Sai Baba, like a saint will meet a saint when they need to, like when the disciple's ready, the teacher comes, for where they're at. And so he meets a saint, and also the same part of the world, and his name is Ambrose, Saint Ambrose. And he comes to Ambrose, and he says, I can't understand Christianity at all. My mother wants me to convert. I'm thinking about it, but I can't in good conscience, until I get it or something, okay? So Ambrose said, well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to give you a book and some scrolls. And these are written by somebody named Plotinus, okay? And Plotinus lived 100 years earlier, so he's after Christ, okay? And Plotinus, it's like Plato, but it's Plotinus. He lived in Egypt, okay? 600 years after Plato. But Plotinus was a Platonist, and he's sort of or what they call Neoplatonists, the Neoplatonists. And he's the most famous Neoplatonist. So he has read Plato, and he has he's carrying on the tradition of the cave, but he's developed it. So it's 600 years later, and the whole idea of the cave is much more developed now. And that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to say what I think is actually they're trying to convey, because I think that Baba is conveying this even more. I'm going to show you. But, so Augustine gets handed these, and he says to Ambrose, he says, well, what are you doing? I thought you're a Catholic saint, and you're giving me these books by a pagan. Which was, he was a pagan, believed in the gods and stuff. And he said, well, you know, the pagans are very smart about some things. And sometimes it's good to just take what you like and leave the rest. Like, you just trust me to read this. And so he read the works of Plotinus, and I'm going to explain a little about what Plotinus taught. Plotinus is very hard to understand. It's even hard, but I think I can convey it. I think you'll have some idea of what he's getting at. Now understand that when Plotinus is writing, Plotinus doesn't have certain concepts that we have right this minute, everybody in the room. They didn't exist. They were concepts that didn't exist. Okay? So when he's describing things, he has to describe things using metaphor, because he doesn't even have the concepts to describe it any other way, but he can see it, okay? Now, remember, let's go back to the cave for a minute we don't need to go back to the picture. The cave is sort of like, I'm going to explain, it's kind of in yourself, okay? When you look, okay, how am I going to explain this? Okay, so when I'm looking out at the world, the Plato says, I'm very interested, it's very, what do you call it when something is very attractive, it's stimulating and interesting, it really attracts your attention, physical things, okay? Baubles and things you're going to buy, and right, travel and gold, and women and men, and exotic. That's what it is. It's exotic, and it attracts the attention. And that's where most people who are not developed live their whole life. Their attention is on the physical outward. Okay. Now the next level, if you turn your attention away, in order to pay attention to it, you have to sort of not pay attention to the physical things. You'll start noticing your thoughts. So for instance, if we really want to think, sometimes we'll go where it's still and there's not a lot of exotic stimulation. Or we'll close our eyes and we'll look at our thoughts. Now this, he says, is more real, okay? But if you want to get to the more real, if you can stop listening to that mental chatter, you'll start to see more real the forms, which I'm not going to get into explaining that, but they're things like mathematics, okay, like geometry, which is always true for everybody in all places and times, but you have to, in order to focus on geometry, you have to stop looking at all the clutter in the room. So you see that you are pulling inward, okay? Now, if you can now do what's called the turn, okay, you can actually, well, this is done through meditation. They meditated in Egypt. If you then, the turning, or you could say this whole story is the turning, or the turning is the last segment. And Baba uses this word, the turning. That's the word for the involutionary turn. If you turn, you'll see the source. I remember the cave, if you go out of the cave, there's the sun. And that source is all unified. It doesn't have any duality like mathematics does, or like all our mental chatter does, or like the material things. All of them have duality to them. But the source, like a sun, or the nous, or the one, is the source. Now that source you will find only one place, in yourself. But it's not your ego. It's not you. It's the same source that Al will find if he looks within himself. So this philosophy was called, and is called today, emanationism. It's a source of Kabbalah, Sufism, and nearly all forms of mysticism come from emanationism. Okay, so in the middle you have the one, and then you have emanations. And each emanation is less real, okay? And then finally, the outer one is matter, the stuff that we look at. And this is the one that in here, okay? And then it doesn't matter, you just have to get the general gist of this. That what people take as the most real, when they're gross conscious, is upon inspection the least real, and vice versa. That's where Baba says, what people see as everything is actually nothing, and what people see as nothing is actually the everything. That's like this. Baba is totally an emanationist in infinite intelligence. Now, he reads this.
I have a story.
Yeah,
I just
go ahead.
gone to a discourse meeting a couple of weeks ago.
Okay.
And Philip read that something about somebody was with Muhammad, the must, and they were talking about seeing whatever, and he said, "You see with your eyes," and he just laughed. He thought it was.
Oh, you do see with your eyes.
Very amusing.
That's really good.
You still see with your
Sure.
eyes.
Muhammad said this to the pilgrim, do you still see with your eyes?
Yeah.
No, I thought they
He said
asked
that to
Muhammad,
somebody.
do you still see?
He had made, Muhammad was there, I don't remember the whole story,
Okay.
but that when Muhammad heard this person saying, that he saw something, he just got a big kick out of the fact that he still saw with his eyes.
With his eyes,
And
yeah.
still-
Right.
Yeah.
Right, that's what these guys are saying. By the way, Plotinus went blind. And his last writing he didn't do. He had a disciple do his writing for him.
Now that there's a guy named Maurice Nichols that Kitty Davy talks about in her talk, and I read a lot of books by this guy, Tony Parsons, who also mentions the same guy, Maurice Nichols. So I bought one of his books, and he gives like esoteric interpretation of Christian terms. And he said when Christ meant repent, what he meant was to make a 180-degree turn,
Right.
to turn within, to see within.
Right,
That's
right,
what the word
right,
repent meant at
right.
one time.
Right.
Yeah.
It didn't really mean forgive your sins, it just meant to see, perceive it anew, or perceive it truly.
Right. Now, I want to say that Augustine, he read this, and he had an experience shortly after. It's very moving, and it's in his book, Confessions, which is the story of his life, and it's the first autobiography in history. And it's a great work of literature. And I have 3 editions, because it's worth reading 3 editions, because the differences in the translation, it's that beautiful, that you want to know how did he interpret that. Some of it. But he was in a garden, and I think it was maybe a church garden, maybe, I'm not sure. And he suddenly had an experience of light or something like this, and he passed out, I believe. And either as he woke or as he passed out, he heard a little girl's voice from behind, like it was behind a wall, saying, "Pick up and read." And so I think there was a Bible there, and he opened the Bible, and it's been a while since I've read it. I think he read a particular passage in the Bible. And at that moment, he got it. So he had been exposed to all the sermons and everything, and Jesus. Now, he got something really important, because he didn't just get, oh, this is saying the same thing as Plotinus. No, he got something beyond what the emanations had, that Christ had brought. Or why would he get excited? He'd just be in emanations. They believe, let's look at their thing like this. Let's look at it like light coming. I wish I had a better one of these. Does anybody know where there might be? Well, anyway. Say there's like this sun, and you don't look at this, and then if the perfect state, the ultimate state, if you could reach it, is that you're focusing, all your focus is on the one, the beautiful reality, okay? And you're supposed to think about the forms all the time, mathematics and geometry, and then when you can, if you can, you get to, think about the one. And then, you really made it. That's as far as you could get in this philosophy. But he said, but where's the love in this? How do you love something that abstract? Because, that'd be wonderful. Because that one, whatever it is, the nous or whatever, it's just like a concept, It had it wasn't inspiring. So this is the saint in St. Francis, that he recognized that that's not enough, that nobody's heart could open up worshiping the one. It's kind of like Baba talks about how, like the beyond God. That's what Baba would call that. And so he realized that Jesus, that this had taken birth as Christ, so we could meet him and see what he was like and love him. And this was something that people were really capable of doing. And you didn't need to be an elitist philosopher, know-it-all, better than everybody, Gnostic. You could be just a God, a Christian, and love Jesus, and you're doing the same thing, because that's what that is. The Word, which is really the reality, or the note,
I think the word is similar to what Baba means when he says the wind.
Right.
He says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and all things that were made by the Word.
Okay, so anyway, this is what he felt, is that...
Or logos. Sometimes they refer to it as logos.
Then Ambrose, he went to Ambrose, and Ambrose said, well, we've had a big breakthrough. Okay. And he says, I'll tell you what, Ambrose was a saint, and he recognized where Augustine was. And he said, he gave him a pot of ink, and he said, you are one of the greatest writers I've ever seen. You need to write. You need to write.
Oh.
So he gave him an order.
Want to take a short break?
Yeah, we can take a long break.
And you can edit this part.
Yeah. No, we can take a break. I'll edit it
Oh,
later.
is this being filmed?
Yeah.
Oh, you're filming it.
Yeah, but let's take a break, because
Well, that's
I
what
might do this again, because I'm not doing so good.
We're gonna try to pretend it didn't happen, but it did happen.
No, I think that we're just going to do this. I'll just do it again another day. Because I never did it before.
I read something recently,
Yeah,
and you had mentioned difference and no difference.
This might be.
that might be better.
And
Safer. There's another one of these, so it'll be okay. Yes, go on, Al.
And anyway, this is a quote by William James, where he says, the only difference between difference and no difference is a difference in degrees. So that kind of eliminates the good and the bad. If you saw degrees from like even Baba says, there is no bad. It's just a low degree of good.
Right.
The lowest degree of good.
Right.
When you talk about degrees.
Right.
Which is quite different than, this or that, somewhere in between. And most people are somewhere in between.
Well, it's interesting to know, and I'm just going to keep going, because I'm going to redo this another
Yeah,
time.
okay, fine.
But what Augustine ended up writing from that point forward, from that vision, is the philosophy of Christianity. And he's a doctor of the church. Another one is Saint Teresa, who's also a doctor of the
And
church, who Baba
Saint
talked about.
Ambrose and Saint,
Right.
I don't know if Bernard was, but there's another one.
Catherine?
Who?
Was Saint Catherine?
No, she wasn't a doctor of the church, but she was one of the favorite saints of Baba. Right? The point is that this was and continues to be, he is the most philosophically important Christian that ever lived. He is the philosopher of Christianity. And so, when you hear, oh, well, the Christians have it wrong, there's black and white, we from Baba learned that there's just, evil is just absence of good. No, that's in Christian theology. It's just that most people don't know it. Got it?
Yeah.
So they have that, they just don't know they have that. They just don't know. And actually, when you meet a person who's talking like good and evil and black and white, that person is really inherited from the Manichaeans. Because the Manichaeans had an influence on Christianity because they were huge competing religion. They were bigger than Christianity for at that time. At least more far-flung. And so, that's something that's important. Now, there's some other neat things that Augustine taught. One of the interesting things is that I heard that Baba said that the soul comes into the fetus in the 5th month. Did Baba say that? Did you ever hear
No,
that?
I read that in a spiritually evolved being, the soul can enter the fetus right up to the end.
Right.
But ordinarily, it doesn't enter till after 6 months. But for a spiritually evolved being, they can wait till the
5th month.
very end.
Well, anyway, so Augustine said this. He said that the soul entered in the 5th month. It's just interesting because I'd read it from Baba too. He also gave a doctrine on just war, which is really great because none of the wars that we fought, except World War II, would qualify even close to what Augustine called just war. And that's a doctrine they still talk about. It's not at all, it's completely ignored today. But it's a very narrow set of reasons why a person could go to war, And that's really wonderful. And he was, so, now let me see, what else, what are we going to talk
How
about?
about his book, The City of God? Now, that was more...
The City of God is interesting because the thing that's going on, well, that's because Rome was a sacred city because of Peter. And in Christianity, it was the sacred city. And when Rome fell, it was like a psychic shock to the Christian world. And he was there in Hippo when the Visigoths sacked the region where he was, actually. And so he wrote that to kind of repair the psyche of Christianity, how the city of God is not a physical place, the city of God is within. Oh, and that's wonderful, because this is the next thing I wanted to show, and why I need this and that. Okay, now, this comes from a book called Augustine's Invention of the Inner Self. But anyway, this is from a book I read. And it's a depiction of St. Augustine's, from the Confessions, his explanation of reality that's Platonic, like Plotinus, okay? But it's different, okay? It's kind of like this hall, and we're all inside, sort of locked in our private spaces. When you experience the material world, you're really only experiencing your own body. I mean, it doesn't seem like it, but you're really kind of living in a little solipsism. It's kind of like, it's a private reality. Even though it looks like it's the real world, it's really just a private, personal cave that you're in, okay? And everybody's in this, and then there's these things, and you walk, I can't do it perfectly, but you walk out here, and when you get to the middle, and everybody's out here, and if you stand in the, you kind of, through meditation, you go within, you stand, and then above you is the light that everybody shares, and you get into this light, and this is God, and so we all share the same God, and that God is within us. And in the turning, he doesn't have merging like God realization, like Baba teaches. He has more of what people always have, which is sort of like being in the presence of. But anyway, that's how he did that. It's like a cathedral.
You ever see, sometimes they show higher dimensions and they take the example of points. And if you're a point, you're familiar with points, but you have no idea what a line is. Then when you're a line, you know what lines are, but you have no idea what a plane is.
Yeah.
Then when you're on the plane, you know what a plane is, but you have no idea what a sphere is. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
At a dimension higher than you, you have absolutely no idea what it's like. And that's why Baba says you can never get God with the mind, because I think the mind is a mechanism that divides everything. Its function is duality.
Right, the mind
how
can't
you
go
gonna
beyond
comprehend
itself.
oneness
Yeah.
with something that does nothing but divide, differentiates, is restless, complains, is ignorant. You see what I'm saying? It's just a dimension above ours.
Okay, now I'm going to say what happened. I was going to talk about perception and stuff and in my own, but I'm going to skip that because it's fine. We'll end shortly. Yeah. So we've been going about 40 minutes, but we'll go another 20 minutes.
We've only just begun.
I know, but I'm going to do it again another day because I'm kind of hot. I don't know if anybody else is.
No?
I'm okay.
Kind of uncomfortable. All right, so let me tell you what happened. This is interesting. So Augustine writes, and he dies. He lives a long life. Well, he lived to be 75, I think. And then he dies, and then he leaves this massive writing, and it changes. It's the intellectual foundation of Christianity. And then Augustine, intellectually, is the core of Christianity. And I'm going to tell you what happens in a little story about Christianity. Christianity was essentially a Platonic religion, meaning it really has the behind it, the background, the grounding of it is Plato. Okay? Levels of reality and all this. It's sort of deeply mystical. Okay? And this continued after Augustine to be the case for 800 years. Christianity. And during that time, there's only one church. Don't buy that there was any religious wars of Christians fighting Christians. There was just one thing. There was no division. Then, what happened is, this around the year 1100, and I can't give the exact numbers, okay? The Crusades began, a crusade to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims who've made it to the shores of Vienna and stuff. So, and in the Crusades, they found the ancient books of Aristotle. And Aristotle was really shockingly exciting and new to the Europeans. Well, because Aristotle has a whole other kind of thinking that's materialistic, empirical, and based on logic. Aristotle invented logic. It's real different. It's like if Plato is mysticism in this painting by Raphael, just to the right, that's Aristotle, and you'll see his hand over here. That's the point of this. His hand's pointing down, earth, and Plato's pointing up to the mystical realm of the forms and the one. And he's pointing, no, duality, okay? And logic is based on duality, yes and no, true and false, very different. And this then took over Europe, this new thinking, very quickly. And the Platonist aspect is lost by Catholicism. Now that takes a little explaining too. There's also a division starting around the year 800 to about 1000. There's a division between the Eastern Church, which is the Orthodox Church, which is like in Syria and Iraq and in Constantinople. Okay, it's in the East, and then the Catholic Church. There's this break, and that break was the doing of the Catholic Church. They actually even waged a crusade against Constantinople. But where you have the continuation of Platonic Christianity is right to today in the Eastern Church. Those places that we've been bombing. We're killing Orthodox Christians, you know, and terrorists are and everything. They've been suffering. And the Armenians are Eastern, right? The Orthodox.
Yeah, they call them Byzantine sometimes.
But, right, or Byzantine, same
It's
thing.
the same, isn't it the same with the Greek? The Greek
Well,
Orthodox
It's the Greek,
Church,
it's the Greek, right.
rather than
They also,
Catholic.
there's a
The Greek
Russian
Church,
Orthodox.
that's right. But by the way, the word Byzantine was invented in the 1800s. It was always just called the Eastern Roman Empire.
Yeah,
But now, I could give a longer story maybe next time, but we, Americans, and let's just say just generally, because we're all of different ethnicities and everything, okay? So some will go, what do you mean we? right? But we really are not the descendants culturally of the ancient Greeks and Romans. We are really the descendants of the barbarians from the Germanic tribes that came down in and took over Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, the Roman Empire went on for another 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And it's continued to have Platonism and this kind of mystical Christianity. But the Western one went this Aristotelian way. And then the Catholic Church is the one that broke into the Protestant, right? They have the Reformation. And then the Protestants, they break into the thousands of kinds of Protestants. And so all that we have ever encountered that we called Christian did not have this in it anymore, this mysticism. We sort of have like white bread. It's like all the good grain. Hey, Al, I need you to pay attention to your helps.
I was trying to find something.
But anyway, okay, so.
I'll ask you, you might know the answer.
So anyway, it's kind of been bleached out. And that is why when we there's kind of there's a kind of a strange barrenness to Christianity that we are exposed to, where it wasn't always that way, and in some places it isn't. And that's all I had to say. This is cool. This change from Platonism to Aristotelianism, from mysticism to this sort of like logical arguments for God and stuff like that, did not affect the Franciscans. I don't remember the reason, but the Franciscans felt that all these changes that were happening, okay, this sort of philosophical change that was happening after the Crusades, didn't have anything to do with them. They didn't acknowledge any of the councils of the church that were had after a certain date. They went on with their Platonic mysticism. So they're the sort of like a little island within Catholicism that did always hold on to this mysticism. And there's even reasons why ironically, that made them more capable of understanding science, and the Franciscans had major contributions toward the development of the scientific method in the West. And Copernicus was who realized that the Earth goes around the sun, was a Franciscan. And the Franciscans were very progressive in their thinking. See, the reason that I know I'm rambling, but it all does make sense, but I'm just doing it too fast. The reason the Catholic Church condemned Galileo, okay, is because Galileo was contradicting Aristotle, who said that the earth was the center of the universe. Because you see, the church had become Aristotelian, okay? They had lost mysticism. And if you could see the arguments that he had for why the earth had to be, you'd see that Franciscans, being Platonic, would not have had those hang-ups and would have had no problem going beyond Aristotle. One of the things that Aristotle thought was that the world had to always have a perfect order. So for instance, when Galileo looked through his telescope at the moons of Saturn or Jupiter, I think, they weren't round. But Aristotle said every sphere in the universe has to be perfect circle, because everything is like ordered this way, according to Aristotle. But because everything has to be perfect, because to make the world rational. But the Platonists had no reason to believe that, because they understood the physical world as being a meaningless illusion. So the idea that there were flawed, potato-shaped moons of Jupiter would not have disturbed a Franciscan. Isn't it weird? So they're the mystics, but they wouldn't be disturbed by a potato-shaped moon, because they don't think there is anything important about the physical world. So that it's all a little. Also, another thing that screwed with Western Christianity was that the planets didn't go around each other or the sun in circles. They went in ellipses like this. Well, that went against Aristotle. Everything had to be perfectly round. Again, the Franciscans would have had no problem with them being ellipses, because it's just a stupid shadow of reality. If you want to find reality, you look toward geometry and the forms, which are within. They're mental. So, while I don't even think I could have followed what I just said if I was listening to it, because I'm doing it as a first chance, and I'm videoing it, so I'll put it on my own site. I'll probably redo this.
I had read somewhere
That's it.
that that there was a time during the library at Alexandria, it was a very eclectic library. The people, Hindu, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, they kind of shared their knowledge. And that before the library was burned by the Vandals, that they hid many of these books in the desert. And there was a supposition that these books will see the light of day. And when they do, we can look back to say, hey, this was the Buddhist, this was the Hindu, this guy was Jain, and look how they all got together and got along with each other. And also when you mentioned Galileo, that also Copernicus and Galileo, they recanted, so they weren't.
No, Copernicus didn't recant because he published posthumously, so he
Well,
wouldn't
they were
have
going to exchange. Well, this Giordano Bruno, he didn't recant.
No, they killed him.
They killed him.
They
That's
killed
what I'm
him.
saying. That's
They
why
burned
the
him.
others
They burned him.
recanted.
They burned him.
They burned him at the stake.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
I don't remember, but did St. Augustine say anything about the virgin birth?
I don't know.
Because that was another thing that Giordano Bruno didn't believe in, the virgin birth. And the way that, you can see from Baba's cosmology, since the avatar had no previous lives, he has to be pure. In other words, there's no original sin is one life after the other, and you have to balance out your karma.
Right.
But
So
the
that may have been the
avatar,
meaning of
he
the
comes
virgin.
from a virgin birth because he didn't have any previous births, and that's why the rules don't apply to him. But they misunderstood that. They said, oh, the virgin birth, his mother must have been a virgin.
Yeah, but the problem is that Muhammad said that Mary was a virgin.
That might have, but Baba didn't say that.
But then
But you see what
also
I'm saying?
Baba once said what that meant was that she was pure of heart.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
Pure in
Yeah,
mind.
without
That
the
could have
lust.
meant that, but the way they interpret in Christianity is that she gave birth